ourselves people who don't investigate bilingualism and perhaps take a little bit of it for granted. And so this is really for you guys. As Aloy mentioned, people from my lab are online. Fatih Bayram and Jorge Gonzalez Alonso and Maki Kubata, and they'll try to answer questions as we go along. So as Aloy also said, feel free at any point to add your questions to text boxes. I think you can actually vote for them, and I'll try to do orally as many as possible. So without further ado, sorry, okay. That's the one cheesy effect that we're gonna have today. But I wanna start by asking, and a poll has just actually come up, who are bilinguals? So how many of you know who would and wouldn't count as a bilingual? In other words, what I'm trying to ask you is that you basically know what a bilingual is, what we're talking about. So if you could just take 2 seconds to answer, yes, you do know, no, you don't, or that you're unsure, I'd really appreciate it. So just take 2 seconds. And let's see. Okay, so well, that's actually very nice, right? So if I'm looking correctly, 66% of you absolutely know what bilinguals are. So that's fantastic. About 3% of you don't know, and I guess that's really cool too. We'll talk about that a little bit. And it's really interesting to see that 31% of you are unsure. So I just want to also say, because we're going to go into a little activity, Aloy promised that this would be interactive, and we've really made some efforts to make this interactive. I'll explain to you what we're going to do over the next 5 minutes or so. But I just want you to know from the start that I am absolutely not trying to trick you, okay? So go with your gut instinct and really just reply how you think, okay? So I'm going to go through in about 5 seconds, a series of 8 examples, one by one on a screen. And all that you have to do, if you have a piece of paper next to you, great. If not, hopefully you can remember up to 8. I'm going to read scenarios to you. And what I want you to consider is if after I read the scenario, if you consider this person bilingual. So for the 66% of you that were absolutely sure, you should have no problem answering whether a scenario I present to you is an example of somebody who is bilingual or not. And maybe the 31% of you will have some intuitions. I really want to see at the end what your intuitions are. At the end of these 8 scenarios, another poll is going to come up and you're going to enter your score. Obviously, your score could be 0 if you think none of the scenarios are bilinguals, or it could be all the way up to 8 or any number in between. So shall we get started? Let's go. Okay. So this is Matteo. Matteo was born in the Netherlands. His father is native Dutch. His mother's from Italy. At home, Italian is the language his mother exclusively uses, and she's really good at it, very, very resolute about doing that. Matteo is a naturalistic simultaneous bilingual of Dutch and Italian, because his dad always provided Dutch, and he's relatively balanced in comprehension and speaking abilities in both. Looking at Matteo, what does he look to be, 9 years old or so? However, he cannot read or write in Italian as he goes to a Dutch monolingual school, and he's perfectly age appropriate in these abilities in Dutch. Is Matteo bilingual? If so, you now have a score of 1. If not, you still have a score of 0. Brendan's from New York City. His parents are from Jamaica. He speaks a typical New York English variety. By the way, basically what you're hearing now, because I'm also from New York, as well as Jamaican Creole, patois, which is an English-based Creole. I've actually given you some examples of it so that you can see, and I will do a very poor job in trying to say at least 2 of them for you, which was the language spoken to him as a young child. So this is the language that's spoken at home. This variety, depending on your view, a variety of English, a Creole of English, okay? So if you want to say, I will be right back, mi sun kam, I haven't seen you in a while, a long time, mina siya, for example. It sounds very much like English. I won't even embarrass myself with the middle option, but as you can see, you start to see that it maybe diverges a little bit from immediate understanding if you only speak standard English. Well, is Brandon bilingual? Ping was born in Berlin to parents who are immigrants, who are native Mandarin speakers from Beijing, China. For whatever reason, they only spoke to him when he was a child in German. He did not start to learn Mandarin until he went to university, where he started studying it intensely, maybe reclaiming some of his identity linguistically that he didn't have at the age of 19. So 5 years have passed. At the age of 24, he's very good at speaking and understanding Mandarin, but sounds quite different from his parents. Is Ping a bilingual? Mireia was raised in Seville, which is in southern Spain, but her family is from Barcelona. She learned Spanish and Catalan. Her parents are native speakers of Catalan as her first languages in her home. When she started school, she began to use Catalan less and less and progressively over time. Now at the age of 14, she never produces Catalan, but she can understand it very, very well. Is Mireia a bilingual? So you can have up to 4 now. You can have 4, 3, 2, 0, or 1 or 0. Ana Lucia is from Portugal. At the age of 19, she moved to Brazil. For those of you who don't know, Portuguese, I'm giving you air quotes, is spoken in both contexts, okay? Now in her early 30s, she's adapted to the Brazilian variety of Portuguese while in Brazil, which is the vast majority of her time, and uses it with her children. She got married, she has children, she has a family, and she's lived since 19, the rest of her life, 11 years in Brazil. But when she speaks to her family, which is very often, she and visits Portugal, there's no question that she uses European Portuguese, markedly different from the phonology to all the relevant syntactic and grammatical differences. Is she bilingual? Tamer's 28 years old. He was born in Hyderabad in India. His native language is Hindi. He began to take English at a relatively young age, but didn't really become highly proficient until his late teens, when he realized he really wanted to live and study in the UK. Now at 28, a graduate of Oxford University, it's pretty impressive. He now lives and works in the UK. Is he a bilingual? I think we have 2 more. Nara is 17 and she's from London. Although there is no cultural connections whatsoever, her parents enrolled her in the Lycée Français in London. And this is a French immersion school based on the French national curriculum. So primarily French speaking, in fact, with very high success rates of imparting the French language. As a result, she can pass to most people for a native speaker of French. However, at home, on the weekends, typically with friends, even when she's in school, so let's say in recess or downtime, and with all her family, she only speaks English. Is she a bilingual? And finally, we have Betsy from Austin, Texas, and she's 60. She was a seemingly lifelong monolingual, as many Americans are, until her eldest son did a study abroad in Sicily and never came back. That's every parent's nightmare, I'm sure. At the age of 52, she began to take Italian so that she could communicate with her grandchildren. So her son got married and stayed in Italy. She's very far from perfect, but she handles herself quite well in Italian and even knows a little Calabrese, the local dialect, in Campania, and she could get by with it when she's there. Is Betsy a bilingual? Okay, so now what's your score? We're gonna have another poll come up right now, and you just mark on the poll 0 to 8. We'll give you a couple seconds to do that. So has everybody done it? Okay, maybe we'll see. Okay, fantastic. Okay. So it seems that we have a distribution, my favorite distribution, okay? We have a distribution that hits the gamut. The only number that's skipped is 2. You can all see the poll yourself. So 1%, and I'm not sure how many people are there right now, 1% is, I think, more than one individual, doesn't consider any of these people to be bilingual. That's quite interesting. An equal low percentage thinks only 1. But there's several people who consider only 3, only 4, only 5. Now we're getting higher with 6, 7, and 8. And if we take the higher ones and we collapse those together, at least 6 of these cases marks 50% of you recognizing them or considering them bilingual. Well, what's the actual answer? I'm not going to tell you actually, but I'm going to discuss some variables with you that I'm not sure you were realizing that I was playing with, okay? So we could ask what factors qualify somebody as a bilingual, right? Does the environmental context matter? right? Does it matter if the society, for example, is bilingual, which I'm not sure, I can't remember right now if that would even cover anybody. Is it proficiency, right? Do you have to have a certain threshold? And we're going to unpack some of these things over time, what that means. If you only understand a language, but you can't use it, but you've acquired it naturalistically, are you not bilingual? I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I know when I travel, and I travel quite a bit, when I was in Japan, for example, then I really know what it's like to not have any competence whatsoever in a language. So of course, understanding a language is at least something, okay? What about time and age of acquisition? Perhaps Betsy can't possibly be a bilingual, even though she can handle herself very well when she's in Italy and she's talking to her grandchildren. So obviously there's motivations and emotional connections for her. But perhaps for you, you don't consider her bilingual because you think that there's an age cutoff to which you could really consider yourself bilingual as such. Well, what about literacy, right? Remember Matteo. Matteo is a naturalistic bilingual. I told you that Matteo can speak in both languages really, really well, pretty close to balance, but he can only read and write in Dutch. Is that something that you used as a deterministic variable when you gave your numbers? What about cultural ties, right? Well, Betsy's out again because she has no tie to she has no cultural tie, let's say. She has some love and family tie, but no cultural tie itself to the language. Maybe there's some confusion on what constitutes a language. So for example, I gave you the Brandon example, which is standard New York English and Patois, Patois being a Creole. Maybe you don't consider those as different languages, but they occupy a similar space. Or what was the other example? The Portuguese example with Ana Lucia. Maybe that's just too close for comfort. I have to tell you, because I'm sure many of you have not had much experience between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, but you could make a really nice argument that the space between, the typological distance between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese is in many ways larger and not as large as it is to potentially other really closely related Romance languages, for example, Galician, okay? And to a greater extent of difference, even Spanish, right? It's certainly possible to have some level of mutual intelligibility between those languages, okay? Well, we could ask, are any of these factors more important than others? The answer to that is, of course, yes, and it's, of course, no at the same time. From a research perspective, it really does matter because lots of these things help us to categorize different types of bilingual. And that's one of the leitmotifs that we'll talk about today, is that I can't tell you or profess to know anything about bilinguals as much as I can tell you that we know increasingly more and more about types of bilinguals and how people subcategorize at group levels, but also individual levels, okay? And we're gonna talk a little bit about some knock-on effects of bilingualism eventually in the talk, and we might keep active, if you will, the idea that maybe some of these are deterministic for some of the knock-on effects. Some of these, I don't like the word benefit and I don't like the word advantage, but some effects that we might see related to bilingualism. Okay, so again, I'm often asked, what is my number? I don't ever think about it, to be honest with you. I use this exercise a lot. I'm more magnanimous, and I probably am going to tell you that I think all of these people are bilinguals of different types. Now, what I can also tell you is that each of the scenarios described have been used within research to describe a particular type of bilingualism, which researchers across a wide spectrum of type of research, from sociological and ethnographic to cognitive neuroscience and linguistics and psychology and many avenues in between. All of these people will be somebody that you can find described in books and papers and dedicated volumes to different subtypes of bilinguals. Okay. So what is a bilingual? Okay, I'm going to be relatively neutral, and I want to tell you that, at least from my perspective, because I approach this as a trained linguist who's interested in psycholinguistics and cognitive neuroscience, that for me, it's important that we're talking about somebody who has knowledge, who has a mental representation of more than one language in the black box. To be perfectly honest with you, whether or not they can use this language readily at all, and those would be called receptive bilinguals, those that understand but can produce, is by the way, just incredibly interesting. And my father was one of those. So really incredibly interesting how that could actually happen. But clearly there has to be something within the black box of the mind and some type of representation to be able to decode linguistic input that's coming in. Okay, so native bilinguals are those that have two native languages, like Mateo, for example, sometimes called 2L1ers or simultaneous bilinguals. Okay, those have been studied really extensively since the 1970s, especially in the context of Europe. Okay, so we know quite a bit about them. Some bilinguals become bilingual later in life. Now note the definition, the loose definition I gave you, an individual who has knowledge of one or more languages, actually it should say of more than one language, sorry, for the purpose of understanding and or speaking. Okay, so that's an important correction. More than one language is a prerequisite to be at least bilingual. And by the way, I should have said from the beginning, there are interesting differences between bi meaning two and people who have more multilinguals. You can ask questions about that, but for now, I'm gonna skirt over that. I'm actually quite interested in that if you have some questions, okay? All right, so some bilinguals are bilinguals who acquire a second language after they've either gone through a significant period of acquisition in their first language where they only had one language, or potentially even after they've completed that, right? So after the age of 4, there are quantitative differences, actually, is what I should say, between how children who are still in the process of development, by the way, a 4-year-old, we all have children, or many of you have children, you know that a 4-year-old is not quite exactly like adults, or even really super close to adults in the way that they speak the language or languages to which they were exposed. But we do know that if you were monolingual till 4 and then you acquire a language, there are differences in at least the developmental sequencing, right? You've had enough of your first language for you to experience things like cross-linguistic influence, transfer from the other grammar. Okay, but then you could also be in your teens. You could also be 12 years old. You could be in the United States. You're very likely to be older than that when you start, if ever, your second language. Okay, I'm including them as bilinguals because they have 2 languages, right? And that's really what we're focused on. Some bilinguals are more proficient in the L2 than their L1. This phenomena is often referred to as attrition, right? So imagine a context. This might be the case for some of you joining us from potentially the UK, for example, where you were a very dominant speaker of your native language, if you were already a bilingual, or potentially a monolingual speaker of your language. Maybe you started learning English before you moved to the UK, but at some point you might have switched in terms of the proportionality of how much you're actually engaging with and using your first language. And there's probably significant consequences to that, to at least the accessibility and the processing of your first language, if not potential knock-on effects, okay? Language skills can vary on a spectrum, as we've seen, from receptive, which is really just understanding, to full production comprehension, with very subtle differences to monolinguals. I will question many more times as we move forward why and how, and if we should use monolinguals as a golden standard. But nonetheless, if that's what you want to focus on, there are, of course, bilinguals who are not distinguishable readily from monolinguals as well, rare as they are. Okay. So now we're going to pull up just one more poll to keep you engaged. And the question is, what do you think the percent of bi and multilinguals, speakers or not, don't worry about speakers, because let's include receptive people, but people who have knowledge of more than one language is in the entire world? So you have 5 choices: less than 20%, 20 to 30%, 30 to 50%, right? There's 7 billion people in the world, so keep that in mind. Above 50%, and I guess that would be above 50 to 70 because we have another choice, above 70%. I'll give you just a couple seconds. Wait 5 or 6 seconds, Aloy. I'll take a swig of my fake wine and you can show the results. Wow, okay. So very interesting. You can all see on your screen. So virtually nobody thinks that it's less than 20%. That's quite interesting. And remember, I'm talking about the entirety of the world. I'm not talking about specific environments. I'm going to break this down to you to some relevant environments for all of you. We're going to talk about Europe. We're going to talk about the UK. We're going to talk about the US, I'm sorry, because I know quite a bit about it. I was there until I left 7 years ago when I moved to Europe. Okay, 10% of you, 20 to 30%, it's getting higher. 18% of you think it's between 30 and 50. 32% think it's above 50, which I guess means anything because 70 would be included in that. But about 37% of you think that it's above 70%. So if I do some really quick math, embarrassingly in my head, that is what, 4.5 to 5 billion people in the world that you would consider to be bilingual. Well, that is very magnanimous of you considering your answers to the questions, because it would appear that many of you have very high criteria for including people in what bilingualism was, but maybe we've already changed our mind. Okay, so I'm going to move on then. And I'm going to just say some general words, and then I'll walk you through the graphs that you see, okay? So first off, those of you who said over 50%, good for you. It's not as high as 70%. That's all of our researchers' dreams, okay? But it is above 50%. So multilingualism is the default state in the global context. Now, in certain countries, in certain environments, even in a naturalistic sense from the society, you really are talking about well over 70%. Don't look at the charts just yet, especially in Africa and Asia. So take Malaysia, for example. You would be really hard pressed to find somebody who only spoke one of the 4 national languages. But there we have something where there is a distribution that's part and ingrained within the society, okay? Over 50% of the world's population, like I said, is multilingual. I'm collapsing that again. And a lot of this, a good portion of this is naturalistic child bilingualism, which doesn't preclude that then people go and learn, especially English, but other languages, but they were naturalistic bilinguals. And now they're really multilinguals because they go through a process of later language learning, like many of us do in much lesser numbers in the Western world, but in particular in the English-speaking Western world. Okay, so now if you could just shift to the first set of graphs, this is actually a chart that is taken from a very wonderful colleague of ours, Viorica Marion, from her lab. It was something that appears in an article she did in 2012. And this is the 2006 reporting of percentages of bilingual speakers in the European context. Now, what should jump out at you already is 2 things. First, when you see the European Union as a whole, which of course in 2006 very much included the United Kingdom, the distribution is just over, nominally over, but over that 50% threshold, okay? When you start to look at some individual countries, what you can see is that, Poland, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Sweden, Norway for sure, where I'm giving this lecture from, would be well above that average. So when we think about how math works, that means some countries are taking the average down, doesn't it, right? Now, of course, this isn't proportional, right? Because, for 97% of Sweden to be bilingual, that's still not necessarily the amount of people that would be in England if we're looking at raw numbers, right? Because Sweden has 9 million people, if I'm not wrong. And of course, the UK is about 60 million. So even just, 15% of people in the UK would be by raw numbers more, okay? Now, it's interesting because the statistics I'm going to show you are actually reported differently, right? It's not the case that 97% of Sweden are naturalistic bilinguals from early on, right? So this is also reflecting in some way the ubiquity of foreign languages and a very high mastery in that foreign language. And if you've ever been to Scandinavia, you know that or Holland, for example, you'll know that English is something that is spoken very well by many, not everybody. Okay, so that's the context with the EU. So now let's start to look at some countries. I'll start with my own. This is being done in the context of the UK. So I don't want to just pick at the UK when I look at numbers. So I always learn that if you're going to pick at something, you should start with yourself, and I'm American, so we'll start with the US. But there's a trend that you're going to see when I show you England in the next slides, and that's going to be that there's something special, for lack of a better word, when we're dealing with English-dominant Western world societies. Because if I showed you this for Australia and for other English-speaking native countries, you wouldn't see numbers that are much different. Okay, Canada is a exception, but I'm a little, how it's reported in Canada, I think is interesting, to be perfectly honest with you. Okay. But in any case, there is a higher incidence of bilingualism there, not least for those who know the context that there are two national languages, right? So that of course would make sense, for that being French and English. So if we look at the US, so if we go to the bottom there, what you can see, two things should stand out to you. Okay. So first, that there's been a sharp growth in people who report speaking a language other than English at home between, let's say, 1980 and 2007. This is actually not the latest statistics. The latest statistics have that final number pushes it well over 21%. So right now it's 19.73%. Now let's just take it as an average. 20%, let's say 20% of the United States speak a language other than English at home and are therefore naturalistic bilinguals. That's different than how it's reported in the European statistics above. 20%. So that looks not so good, right? If we think the world is over 50%. But I want you to keep in mind sheer numbers because of size. Okay, so 20% of the U.S. population is roughly how many people? I have people here. Is roughly 50, 60 million people, okay? Or the entire population of the UK, okay? So something to keep in mind. Now, just a little bit of a side note, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, more than 1 in 5 school-age children in the United States, so that's 20.1%, speak a language other than English at home, okay? So, and that is very similar to what I'm about to show you for the UK. So now let's move on. Actually, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this distributes in Spanish before we get to the UK. Sorry. Okay, so what I don't want to do is to map bilingualism onto any type of ethnicity. That would not be a smart thing to do because, of course, there are many Hispanics in the United States that do not speak who do not speak Spanish, or their children do not speak Spanish, but a very large portion of them do, not least because of continuous migration. So in the next slide, I'm actually going to show you that the Hispanic population is a growing number. But what I really want to do by showing you this map is I want you to focus on the colors, okay? And just in general, I want to tell you that the darker the color blue gets, the much higher the concentration of Hispanics and bilingualism, by the way, in the Hispanic context. And I'm not sure how well you all know the US. If you do, you'll know that Alaska and Hawaii that are sitting under Texas are not actually there at all. But what is there? What is where Alaska and Hawaii are thrown onto this map? Mexico, okay? So we had these states, Texas, now I'm going to embarrass myself. California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, I believe, is what we're looking at. Sorry if that's not the case. It has to be because they have Mexican borders. They share a border, but with a majority, well, not only majority, but almost exclusively Spanish dominant native speaking country. Okay, but if you look at Florida, if you guys know where Florida is, so now we're going to the right on the very tip, you notice that there's a high concentration there as well, right? Does anybody know why? Well, Miami, basically. And there's a concentration of a particular group, and that's Cuban Americans. If you go up the eastern seaboard, you'll get to New York, and that little, very dark little island that seems to be sticking out is New York City, New Jersey below it, New York above it. And you'll notice that there's high concentrations there in the Northeast in general. If you move inland from where New Jersey is, and you're moving to the left, you'll see that there's right by a lake, there's also another high concentration. Well, that's Chicago. So the point that I want to highlight to you is that bilingualism, and you're going to see that this is also true in the UK, is not equally distributed no matter what, but it seems to be something that is highly concentrated, although absolutely not exclusively in urban centers. And where it's not, there usually is some reason, especially in the case of Hispanics. So for example, in Iowa, where Rumiana and I used to live for many years when we were professors at the University of Iowa, there are high concentrations of Hispanics in 2 to 3 particular regions, and these relate to particular industries that are there, in particular the meat packing industry that's there. Okay, so Keep in mind, bilingualism in our countries is not something that you necessarily fall over depending on where you live. And that also means that resourcing and dealing with the needs and fostering effective bilingualism, of course, is going to be different depending on where you live. Okay, so this is actually just to show you that the projection. So from 1970, there was about less than a 10 million population of Hispanics in the United States. The projection is that by 2050, there will be over 130 million Hispanics in the United States. Okay, now the extent to which the language is passed on to all these people is, well, we don't necessarily know. And Hispanics are not much better than other ethnic groups who by a second or definitely a third generation tend to lose the language. But again, we know that we have a constant flux of migration and seasonal workers in the context of the United States, okay? The graph on the bottom actually shows you that the only group that is growing in the context or projected to grow in the context of the US is Hispanics, and that's that turquoise box. So the white US population has been shrinking and will continue to shrink. And while other ethnic minorities or just minorities are basically treading water. So Black Americans, 13%, Asian Americans, maybe a little up and down there, but Hispanics are growing at the exact rate that the white population is shrinking. And I promise I wouldn't be political, but I think that if you do some math that you might be able to figure out that this has something to do with the political nature of my country at present, because the majority is losing or believes it's losing its majority. That's it. No more politics. Okay. So with that in mind, let's move to England. So this is from the 2011 census. 7.7 million, 7.7 million, that would be nice. 7.7% or 4.2 million people reported a main language other than English as spoken in their home, okay? Welsh continued to be the second most widely spoken language in England and Wales, not surprising. This was closely followed by Polish. I'm going to show you numbers in the next slide of different languages, which was ranked the second most spoken language in England. Okay, so notwithstanding Wales. The census shows clear evidence of loss of this cultural heritage home language. Now, how do we know this? 7.9 million people were born outside of the UK, but only 4.2 million report that in their homes, the main language that coexists with English or other than English is 4.2 million. In other words, nearly half of those born outside the UK now use English as their main language. And I'm going to assume by the self-selecting nature of the crowd that is here that you share my thoughts that that's not a good thing. That's probably a bad thing or a sad thing. Okay, so let's look a little bit more about the UK in general. So English, obviously, and Welsh. So Welsh and English are collapsed together. Number of speakers, again, this is over 10 years old, or 9 years old. It's again from the 2011 census. You know, we're talking about 50 million, 92.3%. Okay, so remember the United States reported 20% of that home speakers of the population, and here in England we're talking about just over 7%. So the European statistics are going to change a little bit now that the UK is no longer part of that average that we saw from a couple slides ago. Okay, but Polish has over 500,000 speakers, followed by Punjabi, Urdu, Bengali, Gujarati, Arabic, French, Chinese, and I can let you guys read, okay? Like I told you, for the US, there's currently over 1.5 million learners with English as an additional language. We call them something different. We use different terminology in the US, but I believe you guys call them EAL. In UK maintained schools and even more in independent schools. This is about 21% of the primary population, okay? In London, however, so it's the same situation, right? This is, you know, you get a big city effect with bilingualism everywhere, but of course, this is also true in the United Kingdom. So in London, EALs constitute 39% overall, and as much as 50% or slightly above in certain areas, such as Southeast London. So that's the bar graphs that you can see. So within London, you have over 500,000 people. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how are languages learned? I'm going to make this kind of simple and really not specific to any particular view. But I think what we all agree is that language is learned, well, that is not really learned per se, or at least it's not learned in the same way that you would learn chess or dominoes or so on and so forth, right? Via exposure, via interaction, without considering it being in a vacuum, we acquire language, right? There's that passive understanding of the word acquire. And so I like to liken it to a bulb that eventually flowers, or a seed that eventually flowers. There's something there. Maybe it's specific to language. I think parts of it are. Maybe it's just that we're cognitive beings and therefore this is a byproduct of it, but language basically flowers. But what you have to keep in mind is that just like a seed or a tulip bulb, if you don't have the necessary external items that release this latent potential, it doesn't happen. So we can proverbially talk about water, light, and air. And of course, that's the exposure. It's the social interaction. It's all the things through which language is delivered and mediated. So it's something to think about with bilingualism. Now, I don't particularly love this picture, the first picture, but it's so cute that I wanted to share it with everybody because obviously it's a child's drawing. And so if we use that same analogy, the idea here being that if you have water, you have sun, and you have good air quality, then you're going to see that latent potential flower into its, well, ultimate potential. But what if you have water and not sun? Or what if you have sun but not water? Now, the reason why I don't love this picture is because it looks to be evaluative, right? That if one of those things is missing in somewhat arbitrarily determined ideal portion, that there's that the picture seems to depict that there's something deficient about those. And I don't like even talking about or dealing with deficiencies when what we're really talking about is differences. But the idea stands one and the same. There are deterministic elements to language acquisition, not just whatever cognitive and potentially language specific abilities we bring to that effectively, if we're in the right context, guarantees that flower of language to grow, at least one of them, in the context of monolingualism. I like to better think of it about how if we change the variables of that water, we can get the same flower. Those are all carnations, by the way, but I don't know if you know you can do this. Put some food coloring in water, stick the flower in, and you have rainbow flowers, okay? Everything's the same, but the elements that are involved make the surface look different. Okay, so that's how I like to think about it. Okay, so now let's get to some facts. Okay, so here's some basic facts about bilingual children, bilingualism in general. Bilingual children are soon able to distinguish between their languages, okay? And actually, this is really cool. For those of you who have bilingual children, you probably know that when Nana and Papa come, that you don't need to tell them what language to speak, but if somebody else walks in who they only speak English with, they immediately switch to English, okay? So children make distinctions and they know who to use it with. Children mix languages, and that is absolutely, I'm going to talk a little bit about that moving forward, but that's absolutely normal, and it's actually a good sign, and we'll get to that in a minute. They sometimes start speaking later, but they typically catch up, okay? Or they at least catch up depending on the context, but in supportive simultaneous bilingualism, let's say, that usually happens. But they will become dominant almost always in one language over time. And really, depending on how we frame dominance, I think it's probably always the case that bilinguals, even those really balanced ones, are probably dominant to some degree in one or the other. Under favorable conditions, they're on par with monolinguals developmentally, and in some ways outperform them. And here we're talking about regular development, right? So let's say development of cognitive functioning and so on and so forth, and potentially surpass them. Can differ from monolinguals in linguistic developmental milestones and even ultimate attainment. We know that not all bilingualism winds up with that balance we want to see, especially as it pertains to speaking the language, but they're not deficient even when they show considerable differences to monolinguals. They're different, okay? And actually, we can reverse engineer the variables that they've had, that air, that water, that sun, that would explain that, okay? And they don't need constant correction. I'm sure many of you are parents who correct your children, and you know that is absolutely futile, right? It doesn't really matter because they have developing grammars, to be perfectly honest with you. So if your child says to you, I go to the party, and you say, oh, okay, you went. Or worse, you say, no, it's not go, it's I went. And they'll probably reply to you, yeah, I go. I just told you. No, you went, honey. No, I go. Okay, whatever. It's really futile, so don't do it. Okay, so let's talk about some things that, well, are myths. So I already told you they're myths, but let's see what you think. So as I read these out, think to yourself, do you think this now? Did you think this before I already started to preach to you? And it's okay if you do, but let's unpack them. To be a real bilingual, one must be like two monolinguals, but in a single person, okay? I think some of you thought that, and that might have reflected your answer earlier. Exposing children to more than one language will confuse them. A lot of people think that. Efforts to teach children bilingually robs them critical exposure to the actual important language, disadvantaging them, either scholastically or whatever. Some languages are more important than others, so not all languages should be promoted for bilingualism. Teaching children bilingually with general and linguistic developmental delays is detrimental to them. So if your child has any issues whatsoever, absolutely one language, okay? Reading and writing by literacy obtains in a home language simply by learning literacy in the majority language. So if you're raising some Spanish kids at home right now, we'll just teach them English and, you know, the letters are the same, right? It'll be fine. No. Mixing between two or more languages is a sign of deficiencies. I hear this a lot from parents, and I know that teachers are worried about this as well. And we need to help them avoid doing this. And then finally, there's an age limit for language learning. Adults need not even think about it. Just do Sudoku or something else, okay? Not language. Wrong. I mean, all of these are just flagrantly not true. Okay. So what I'm going to shift now is to talk to you about some benefits of bilingualism. And we're going to talk about different types of potential beneficial effects of bilingualism. So first, we're going to talk about social benefits. Some of these are going to be more controversial than others. So I'm going to talk about the things that I think are less controversial first. Some benefits: self-identity and culture. So first off, just acknowledging and legitimizing their identity and their cultural connections, okay? If you just decide that you're not going to speak a language that you could otherwise impart to them, I don't know what type of message that sends to them. I mean, it's absolutely, of course, everybody's individual choice, but we do know that it will help to legitimize that, okay? It boosts the number of people with whom you can converse. And many of you have parents who don't speak the other language of the society in which you're coming to. And that's one of the saddest things that I think happens when languages are lost in the immediate generations, right? I mean, grandparents should be able to speak to their grandkids and vice versa. Higher ability to recognize what we and other people feel and finding ways to deal with and manage their emotions. Some research suggests this. Better understanding of other people's perspectives, potentially related to theory of mind. Easier to learn another third language, potentially, or to learn language in general. And this is just very cute, but Maki, one of my postdocs, found this, so we included it. Being bilingual may boost your confidence in the dating market, everybody, okay? A Valentine's Day survey done by one language software provider, Rocket Languages, revealed that 79% of people surveyed think someone who is bilingual is more attractive. Well, that may or may not be true. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some economic benefits. So there are discrepancies. So for example, a lot of this comes from the US, but it's not exclusive to the US. Discrepancies in earning between monolinguals and bilinguals in the US can be up to $5,400 annually. Now, of course, this has to be unpacked because this does not necessarily mean that this is notwithstanding the other imbalances that are related to bilingualism, right? But if we're talking about high earning jobs where bilingualism can be an asset and professional type jobs, this is what we're talking about. Okay, so having that advantage to get you to have a professional type career, bilingualism is something that is financially rewarded. English monolingual students are 66% more likely to drop out of high school than relatively balanced bilingual students. Okay. Spanish bilinguals, again, I said a lot of this is relevant to the US, but would exist in various forms outside. Spanish bilinguals were more likely to enroll in college than English monolingual Latinos. So now we're looking at ethnic minorities, those that were bilingual versus those who are not, because a Latino student, a Latino X student is still Latino X, whether or not they speak Spanish, obviously, all else being equal. So those that were bilingual were just more likely to enroll in colleges. And of course, we can have various things covariating here, but a survey with 249 employers across all labor sectors revealed that at least 2/3 of employers responded that, all things being equal, they had a preference for hiring bilinguals. And of course, this is just a general statement. Bilingualism is indispensable for economic globalization. It's just absolutely indispensable. And Western, even English dominant societies recognize this. I remember I was in England for 6 years, as Aloy said. He was at the University of Reading. And I remember a couple years ago, a report coming out from the UK government highlighting the 10 languages that they recommend people for economic reasons and other reasons should study. And I also remember, because I'd done a lot of work with Spanish, that somehow Spanish was at the top of that list. Okay. All right, so now we're going to talk about research on bilingualism and cognition. And here's where things can get, I don't know, so controversial. I think that if we understand it for what it is, that it actually shouldn't be controversial at all. But I wonder if many of you have seen these headlines smattered everywhere. Okay, so everybody likes to look at pictures of the brain, and everybody likes to talk about cognition and whatever. And newspapers love it when you can have headlines like bilingualism, good for the brain, research says. It probably is. Your mind on bilingualism, how bilingualism boosts your brain, so on and so forth. Okay, so a lot of this is putting an evaluative spin on something that is really just something we look at in research. And I'm going to try to unpack this for you. Okay, so here's the main idea, right? So the idea is whether or not, so the question now here is whether or not bilingualism is something that conveys potential beneficiary effects as secondary knock-on effects to cognition. And indeed, we're actually going to talk about the physical structure of the brain. Okay, so here is the basic mechanism. We want to understand that for this to even be true in the first place, we are thinking about what in this black box bilingualism would be doing that would give rise to some type of mental gymnasium for the brain, if you will, that gives rise to secondary knock-on effects in cognition. Okay, so if you can imagine, bilinguals are mental jugglers because they have two languages by definition. They have lexicons for two languages. They have grammatical structures for two languages. And research has shown for actually quite a bit of time now that despite intention and despite need, bilinguals, right now, I speak other languages, they are activated, right? And it's actually for good reason, right? Because if all of a sudden the phone rings and you're a bilingual and you're having a conversation with your friend completely in English, but you only speak Spanish to your mom, I don't know how many of you have tried to start a car in the Arctic in the winter if you left it outside, but it doesn't work so well if it's not kind of warmed up, okay? So the idea here is that there's potentially a low threshold, but you keep the other languages active because when you pick up the phone, you have to be like, hola, right? You have to be able to switch. And of course, this experience happens all the time. So the idea is that no language is ever really shut off. And that means that when you need to be speaking in one language or the other, you have to inhibit that activation of the other language. And this apparently is happening all the time, okay? So here's just to depict, right? You have a conceptual structure of the words 1, 2, and 3. It's a cute picture with bilinguals juggling it. And obviously, depending on the context, you're choosing between one or the other. But the idea, and by the way, this is Polish and English, the idea is that when you say one, Jaden, apologies if I'm not pronouncing it right, would have to be suppressed at the same time, okay? Okay, so what's the consequence of this parallel activity? Resolving cross-language competition is hypothesized at least under particular conditions of active and high engagement with bilingual experiences to have knock-on effects to cognition and the brain, okay? The potential cognitive effects to executive functions might help bilinguals. So the things that I just talked about, inhibition, you need to use more memory, to working memory in general. You need to focus your attention and so on and so forth. These are regulated by a conceptual mechanism called executive functions, right? Think about it as kind of like the central processor, if you will, of the computer that is your brain, so to speak. And the idea is that doing what I just explained for paralleled activation and its relative inhibition is something that maps very nicely on and over these domain general executive function skills, and potentially over time, the ubiquity with which you do that fine tunes them. So research has shown that this will allow, at least again, bilinguals with certain subsets of bilinguals to be better at ignoring relevant information compared to monolinguals, resolve conflict among competing alternatives, minimize costs associated with task switching. Okay, so now very quickly, we're going to do one of these tasks. Super easy. And you just have to, now at home, put your drink aside. What I want you to do is I want you to say the color of the block that you see as fast as you can. Are you guys ready? Here we go. Just say it out loud to whomever's there. Okay, so was that easy? This is, by the way, I should have told you it's called a Stroop task, but I'll explain it in a little bit. Okay, so there you go. That was pretty easy. That's called a neutral condition. Now, what I want you to do is just read the words as fast as you can. Okay, hopefully that was pretty easy as well. Okay, relatively easy. Now we're going to do one last block, and I'm going to ask you to focus on the word again. So do exactly what you did before. Okay, read the word out loud as fast as you can. Ready? Go. Okay, so chances are that was a lot harder to do. And this is a typical Stroop effect. So in the first condition, what I gave you was something neutral. There wasn't competing cues at all. You didn't have any language probing cue. You just said you looked at a color. It was in your visual, you had a visual inspection of the color and you found the word and you said it, okay? In the second one, potentially it was even a little easier because you had the color congruent with the word itself that you were reading. But in that last condition, it's called the incongruent condition. And what you had was conflicting information, and you needed to resolve that conflicting information. You needed to inhibit one or the other. And by the way, Maki actually made that for me, and she wanted me to tell you that that was the hardest way that you could do it, because if you weren't paying attention or you didn't notice, it was always the color before, the color that comes after was the word that was said before, okay? So now what you have to do is you have a conflict between two cues at the same time, and you have to inhibit it. So bilinguals can be faster at that, okay? And this would be showing that they have greater inhibitory control, for example, okay? Now, how that translates to the real world and you should care, I'm not exactly sure, but actually, I am pretty sure if it's true that you have greater inhibitory control, then in all the tasks that we do in life, which are many every day, every hour, we bilinguals might have greater either resources or fine-tuning of this particular executive function to accomplish those tasks more efficiently would be the idea. Okay, but these types of tasks, these psychological tasks, they have issues of replication, even within monolinguals, you know, test, retest reliability, so on and so forth. What I think is really cool is to look at how this affects where in bilingualism this might affect more. So now this is a different task. It's a assignment task. I'm not going to explain it to you, but I'll just say that it's a congruent, incongruent type of task. So similar, different, but similar to the one that we just before. And this is some of the original research, I have to say. And so while people query the extent to which that there's, you know, some replication issue, actually always really from the beginning, and this is, you know, work done in Ellen Bialystok labs, really the pioneer in this type of research. They already showed us from the early 2000s that this different, the magnitude effect of these differences, so in this case, the Simon effect, is actually, you don't see the younger group, but it's also there in the younger group, not to the same degree. But what you see is, yeah, bilinguals are, you know, a little faster, right, through 30, 40, 50. But where you really start to see a difference is when normal cognitive aging takes place, okay? And cognitive aging really refers to slowing down of cognitive functions over time, which is completely normal. So while both groups after 59 start to really see a different effect, right? You start to see an attenuation. That attenuation is much less for bilinguals than it is for monolinguals over time. And it might be the case because of peak, you know, these issues of testing with these types of, you know, executive function tasks during peak level, and, you know, most psychology studies are populated by our students at universities who could not be better in terms of peak level cognition as it relates to this. I mean, their decision skills are always not so wonderful, as we all know, but in reality, their cognition is quite at peak. Here, what we see is at the polar ends, both in children where cognition is not at peak, either because it hasn't developed as such yet, or because it's on its way to its natural decline. We see potentially an effect of bilingualism. So some of you might have heard that bilingualism cures Alzheimer's. That's absolutely not true at all. But what studies show, and actually there's a really nice, I didn't put it, and I meant to be honest with you. For those of you who are interested, I actually read this today. There is a really nice meta-analysis in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review by John Anderson, somebody else in the middle, and John Grundy, that did a meta-analysis. So it's hot off the presses for 2020 that brought all of this research together and shows very nicely that the following. So I'll summarize it in a word or in a sentence. Bilingualism, undoubtedly, when you look at a meta-analysis, bringing all lots and lots of studies together, bilingualism seems to have an effect. And again, that active bilingualism seems to have an effect on the diagnosis and whereby symptoms, behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia, okay, or dementia in general, and probably cognitive aging in general, right? It does not stop the underlying neurodegeneration. What it is it's a compensation at the level of behavior. And that actually maps very nicely on to the idea that there is some cognitive bootstrapping for active bilingualism or bilingualism in general, right? The idea is not that your brain is magically not plaquing or atrophying when you have neurodegenerative disorders, but that you can compensate in behavior for them. In other words, you're diagnosed later because you don't show the overt behavioral symptoms as young. We're almost finished, but it's also the case that sometimes you don't see behavioral effects at all. Sometimes bilinguals and monolinguals look exactly the same. And here's where doing, looking under the hood, so to speak, actually looking at the brain with technology that we have and we can do is actually really quite helpful. So this is a study done, I think it's 2012 or 2014 by Jubin Abudalebi. He's part of our research group here as well. Very well-known person within this domain. And what they show here, so just look at the picture. This is a brain. On the right, you have monolinguals. On the left, you have bilinguals. And this is during a conflict monitoring task. And what you can see here is that, well, you can't necessarily see this, but I'm going to tell you, there's no difference in their performance on the conflict monitoring. So bilinguals and monolinguals performed behaviorally the same. Just think of it for a second. They each got a 90, okay? Or they each got a first or whatever, okay? But at the end of the day, what's different and what you can see by looking under the hood is the neural recruitment itself. And think of that for a second as the relative efficiency and exertion that it took to get that same result, right? Does that make sense? So what you can see is that it took a lot more neurological activity, right, and resources for monolinguals to do the same thing in the same way as bilinguals. In other words, by looking under the hood, and even though we didn't see any difference in their conflict monitoring, what we do see is that bilinguals are much more efficient in doing the same task. Now, if you can run 5 miles and somebody else runs 5 miles, and you do that without breaking a sweat, versus somebody who did, but you both finish with the same time, I think we would all agree there's something either beneficial or something interesting about the fact that the energy or the effort is quite different. So what we see is some fine tuning here. Okay, and then finally, I do want to say, almost finally, but what I do want to say is that, some work that we did when I was at Reading, and this, I think Vince is actually maybe even online, but this was Vince DeLuca, so hi Vince, his dissertation. In recent years, there's really been a focus of looking at bilingualism, not as a yes-no dichotomy, not are you bilingual, are you not? And many studies prior to the past couple of years didn't do a really good job about understanding either what type or what were the individual variables in terms of your engagement going into bilingualism. And what this work shows very nicely is that patterns of regional volume shape. So what we see is changes to the brain. So the red is expansion in this case. And this is the right caudate, a part of the brain implicated in language control. What you see is that this is ameliorated by a factor of how engaged you are. So in other words, not all bilinguals have the same effect, Bilinguals who were more, and for A, it related to social use of the language. So bilinguals who used both languages and change in a social context were more likely to have expansion in this area. And B shows you this is related to immersion, because this was done in England. So this is a factor of the years of immersion that you were in the UK. And this shows both expansion, and that's those little red dots, and that purpley dot is actually contraction, which is probably efficiency and fine tuning. Now in the left caudate, the thalamus and the putamen. Okay. All right. Very good. So I am really almost finished, but I want to leave you with a little bit of a summary. So skilled bilinguals are often highly efficient code switchers in appropriate contexts. This ability, by the way, I have to say, and we didn't say much about it, but it suggests that they have developed a truly impressive mechanism of cognitive control, because when proficient bilinguals code switch, they don't do it randomly. And there's a whole literature that has looked at this. They do this with beautifully meandering through both languages without really breaking the rules of either. Having both languages active simultaneously seems to does produce competition, which acts as an exerciser for the brain, at least under the right conditions. This yields useful cognitive output. A life of resolving cognitive language competition seemingly confers positive changes in the cognitive system and physiological modifications to the brain that probably relate to cognitive aging and abnormalities of cognitive aging, like Alzheimer's or dementia. Okay, well, the evidence to date is mostly correlational, but that's true of the type of psychological science in general, right? They're not always replicated. So it's really premature to say bilingualism equals a cognitive advantage per se. Again, a word I don't like, but without qualification of individual factors, right? The better way to ask this is, what aspects of bilingualism correlate best with some cognitive effects in which groups and at what ages? Active use of both languages, high degree of engagement and investment, degree of code switching, younger and essentially older ages show the greatest effects, as I mentioned before. And are there differences in bilingual types? And even at the individual level, there is. I'd be remiss to not tell you that there's some disadvantages, right? When you compare to monolinguals, bilinguals often have smaller vocabulary sizes. Bilinguals experience difficulty in understanding, potentially speech, when there's background noise more. Bilinguals experience more tip of the tongue effects, searching for those words. And bilingual children, as we mentioned before, often say things later. I'm really one more slide, actually two, but I just want to leave you with some choices that you have. And the first set is really manage expectations, okay? Choosing one or another language is just a false dichotomy. How we manage having both, however, requires effective planning and prioritizing and staying the course if you want the outcomes. Nothing good comes for free. We know for a fact that bilingualism is possible and that there are many benefits. We do not need to have one golden standard as a point of comparison for bilinguals. So you don't have to compare them to yourself or their cousins or whatever. As long as they can communicate with their cousins, that should be sufficient. And then you work on those goals that you want to have. Do we have fair expectations? Bilingual school programs in largely monolingual societies are artificial. That doesn't mean they shouldn't happen. They're wonderful. But how do we address the artificiality of that? Immigrant students, need to keep in mind, are being forced to become literate in a language that they do not yet speak. Okay, this is completely the opposite of the natural case. Remember, I'm a native English speaker. When I took English classes, I already spoke the language. So reading was bolted onto that. Is it really smart to be acquiring the language while you're trying to teach people to read and write the language? Maybe not. And that means that there's a place for mother tongue literacy, potentially before, and research by some colleagues, older colleagues from Reading, Ianthe Simply, for example, comes to mind, who's at Cambridge now, very nicely shows that investments in mother tongue literacy has benefits also for the majority language later. Okay, and this is really it. Here's the take-home points. There are many types of bilinguals. Many factors contribute to their outcomes, linguistically, socially, economically, cognitively. The unfolding of bilingualism has a time course for some aspects, and they can't necessarily be circumvented. You have to stay the course. Effective bilingualism is not guaranteed. It's a long-term investment. So-called advantages of bilingualism are not confined to specific subtypes of bilinguals, but there might be effect sizes. okay, variation. And determining what aspects of the bilingual experience correlate with these advantageous effects over the lifespan is an important part of contemporary research, from cognitive neuroscience to linguistics to sociology and beyond. And here's some benefits. I want to thank you all very much, but especially James, Maki, and Jorge for helping me really make this PowerPoint a lot prettier than I could have otherwise. Just very briefly, this is the what we've gone over, especially towards the end, is some of the research that we do in our lab here where I'm sitting. This is the Polar Lab. And of course, we are nothing without our larger group, which is Aqua Aurora, who very wonderfully hosts us. And we are a very large group up here doing really wonderful work, also in collaboration with our colleagues at NTNU and Trondheim. We have our own branch of Bilingualism Matters. I suggest you check that out. That is from Edinburgh University. That's a charitable organization founded by Professor Antonella Sirachi, that whose mission is to connect to connect and deliver, to make a network to deliver research on language, on bilingualism from all aspects and deliver it to its stakeholders, which is all of you. And here at ACFA, we have 4 themes. You can read a little bit about that, but I wanted to thank them, especially because you know, we are a large team, and without teams, we don't do what we can. And with that, I'm going to tell you to wash your hands and stay home. And thank you very much. And now we can do questions.
Well, thank you, Jason. This was great. And we've had several questions that we can start to address some of them now for a bit of time. So let's start with a question by Dilgash, who says, my kids are already bilinguals in Kurdish L1 and English L2. They have started learning L3 Spanish, but they are mixing L3 words with L2 words and vice versa. Is this normal? And will they ever overcome it?
Yeah, it's normal. I mean, we said that to start, right? So, you know, this, you know, mixing languages is not anything that is abnormal. And I think, you know, if you're in the beginning process, if your children are in the beginning process of learning, that it's not necessarily a sign, as I mentioned, it could be code switching of this, you know, wonderful perfection of gliding like a beautiful figure skater between the languages. But of course, it's perfectly normal that would happen. You know, as they move on in their proficiency and solidifying their language learning experience, it's I mean, an inevitability that those things will work out to the extent that their proficiency grows. I think that if you're in a context, I'm not sure where you're asking your question from, but if their second language, English, if you're writing from England, I promise you their English is going to be fine. Okay, their English is going to be fine. We want to learn more languages for all those benefits potentially that they come to. But keep in mind, Spanish is spoken by about 500 million people natively across the world. So if you have trilingual with Spanish, English, and what was the other language? Kurdish. That's going to open up lots of doors. So stay the course for sure.
Good. So now we've got Fan Gallet, who's a language teacher and mother to a bilingual child. My daughter is 3. We live in the country of her L1, that's language English, and my mother tongue is French. She's just as proficient in both languages and has a very wide scope of vocabulary, but tends to use more colloquial language in the L2 French. She also tends to go to me, ask me in L2 to ask her that something in his L1, despite the fact that she speaks the L1 very well as well. Is this a normal behavior?
It is, and it's just as normal as everything that I'm sure your daughter might be doing and other people who have young children. It's called testing the waters. I remember in my context, it was asking my dad for a cookie because my mom wouldn't necessarily give me a cookie. So you know, we could do this linguistically as well. It potentially is more effortful for whatever reason for your daughter, potentially in a particular space. You know, we can't have an interactive conversation. I'm not, did she mention how old her daughter was, Aloy?
I don't remember now. I think it was 3.
Oh, 3. Okay. So it's going to get worse, by the way, just so you know, when she goes to school and she starts to make, you know, these relationships with, you know, social relationships with her peers in English, she'll probably want to speak the other language less. And that's your choice to not allow it, right? Especially because I think you said that your daughter speaks both languages relatively well. So, your daughter's playing with this space. Obviously, English is the majority context. It's what she's hearing all the time. It's not, French was the other language. Is that right, Aloy? French is isolated to a smaller domain. And I would suggest to you that you keep that domain resolute, especially if she can speak. Now, one thing that you didn't ask, but I do want to say, because I think it's contextually relevant, is that it is very possible for your daughter, who speaks French now, to not in short order, or especially over time. And so what you can do is try to instill practices where you just say no, or daddy's not going to understand me, or whatever the case may be, to get her to ask. I had a grad student many years ago who was just fantastic, absolutely fantastic, had 2 children. And would ignore them in the cutest way I've ever seen, I have to say, when his youngest son did exactly what you're describing, and would either stop speaking to him or ask his mom to ask his dad something. And he would do things like, do I hear, this was in Spanish, by the way, but I'll do it in English. Do I hear a voice? I don't know if I hear a voice, or whatever. And he would really kind of ignore his son. And I have to tell you that probably hurts your husband a little emotionally, when she just, because occasionally, or maybe more often, she's going to be like, well, I don't have to ask anyway. And she'll walk away. But he stayed the course, and his kids, at least at last report to me, and that I was able to see, were pretty good speakers of the language, especially this younger one, who later started to go in the summers as they transitioned in financial resources from grad student to professor, and going home, and all of a sudden there were these explosions. So what I would really suggest to you, and to all of you, is that you put your children as much as you can in a context where they will use the language and where they have peer-to-peer interactions. So one of the most dramatic changes in the children of the grad student I was just telling you about was when he met his cousins and started to have a relationship with them. And all of a sudden, spending 6 weeks in Spain, well, kids want to communicate. And at some point, being silent doesn't work. Okay. So I would suggest that you pursue those avenues, which you can do, by the way, even in the context of English. There are, at the University of Reading, they still do a chapter, like I mentioned, of Bilingualism Matters, where they can gear you towards resources of community groups, depending on where you live in England. I know for a fact, there are French community groups where children peer-to-peer have play groups and reading groups and so on. And I suggest that you have those, or engage with those.
So we've got another question by Vlotlek Jedrovic, and thank you for the insight that bilinguals have greater difficulty in distinguishing words against background noise. I have suffered this all my life. I am now 70, but it has varied with age. Has age variation been studied with respect to this?
Well, to my knowledge, I don't know is the honest answer. But one of the things you want to keep in mind is that hearing, of course, like other domains of our physical sense, naturally deteriorates with time too. I know this already myself in my early 40s. And so you would imagine that if you have such an effect, that will be something that age, notwithstanding bilingualism or any other factor, would be something that would correlate with that. I don't, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know how generalizable that is. I do know that, all things being equal, it's sifting through background noise, in particular in the language that is not the dominant language, for example, becomes more difficult, at least in some the empirical studies that show that. So I would suggest, as I'm sure you have, that you continue to have your hearing checked as well, just to see what is physiological. But you would imagine that that would happen potentially more and more in your less dominant language. And of course, that could co-vary with less and less exposure that you might be experiencing in your less dominant language over time too, right? So it's not necessarily just a physiological effect. It could be a relative frequency effect of having to warm up potentially the engines of dealing with, a stream of input that you are, in terms of relative frequency, not hearing as often. And then also potentially dealing with dialectal variation, for example, right? People who are bilinguals and grow up in contexts where they have very reduced communities can often go back to the parent environment, and all of a sudden, like second language learners experience. Maybe some of you moved to the UK. I'm not a second language learner of English, but I can tell you that the first 2 years when somebody's like, "You're right," I just didn't know what to say to that, because that to me means, why? What's on my face? I mean, so these, when we become exposed potentially to different native dialects and so on and so forth, and we're not used to them, then in addition to there potentially being some physiological effect, there might be some effect of that as well. So yeah, next
So
question.
by Suzanne Witt. She asks whether you think teacher training should include some exposure to bilingualism and bilingual education.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I would go a step further. I think that teacher education should include some linguistic and psychological training as well. And that would probably be par for the course of bilingual education in the first place. Excuse me. I think that especially for teachers who are inevitably dealing with, in the context of the UK, let's say English as an additional language learners, would benefit greatly from having witnessed talks like this, and also being forearmed with knowledge and strategies. Like, for example, understanding that you can't snap your fingers and all of a sudden within the course of a year, students catch up in language, and the knock-on effect of that at the very beginning, right? If you have somebody who's 10 years old and comes from another country and is not understanding you, they're not going to understand your math lectures either. And they're not going to understand necessarily your history lessons either, right? So understanding that there needs to be some transition also, and support for that transition as you migrate towards being and progressively more active bilingual in an immigrant child or other, by the way, situation is quite important. Recognizing that not being able to understand English is not a deficiency. Why should people who are not exposed in childhood instantly understand English? And speaking louder is not going to help. As much as if when British people go to Spain, why would you understand Spanish? You shouldn't. And we need to be empathetic to that, right? But of course, in the context, the goal is to provide them with the majority language for social mobility, for them to be productive members of the society. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but to have not only empathy, but a strategy and training in how you effectively do that. And that requires understanding how literacy is acquired, and literacy skills, and how languages are acquired, and how cognition develops in tandem depending on the age, and how and what is reasonable to expect, and what is signs of deficiency, and what is otherwise just natural delays of bilingualism, right? So, bilingual kids don't have specific impairments to language if within a year they're not caught up to Nigel, the 10-year-old in their class, right? And so, also training on how we assess those things so we don't miss things as well, because we don't want to miss bilinguals who actually do have some special needs as well, right? So absolutely is the short answer to your question.
We've got another question, and says, my friend's son's teacher who's adamant that the 5-year-olds speak only French, both at school and at home. They speak Lebanese, Arabic, French, and English at home. But the teacher says the kid should only speak French. What should we do?
Ignored them. I mean, I really don't know what to say to that. I mean, Aloy, is there any context there? Where are they writing from? Or is this somebody who goes to a lycée français and is in London, or is this somebody in France? Is French the national language?
I assume French might be the national language.
Okay. So then the only thing I can say is absolutely ignore them. There's absolutely no reason. And kind of related to what I said before, because, you don't need, we know you don't have to have 100% of your input in one language for you to be a functional and even balanced bilingual. people believe this in the Western world for reasons, again, I don't want to get into, but you know, all you need to do is go to Africa and Asia and you know, Latin America and various parts of the Western world and various countries and even parts of the UK and parts of the United States to know that that's absolutely not true. So you know, you can't really legislate language, less with children. And of course, children have a right in many ways to develop and continue to develop, especially if they're children, and not be thwarted the continuation of development in what their native home language is. Now, should you be supporting French if you live in France? Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Should there be an additional approach? Yes, of course there should be, and there should be support. But to the exclusion and to the guaranteed death of the other language, there is not 1 ounce of research to support why that would be a good idea to do.
So the French example was from Switzerland. They've just clarified here.
Okay. So a native, probably the French part, yeah.
So we've got another question by Emily Morse, and she wonders, if you learn a language when you are young, but then forget it, will you still have enhanced cognitive function?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I wonder what you actually mean by forget it, right? So let me unpack that a little bit, because, you know, the answer to this, well, the honest answer is we don't really know, and we don't know much about forgetters. And the extent to which forgetters forget, and that means ease of accessing that language, but retain comprehension, and or potentially retain really good grammaticality judgment, for example, so they become more passive, but they forget basically how to speak, or whether we're talking about people who really have replaced a language, which potentially happens and has been studied in the case of adoptees. So some of you who know the research looking on international adoptees, you might have had people who were even 8 years old when they were adopted, maybe from, say, Russia or China or Korea, and brought to, say, England or Paris. There's lots of this research is done in Palier's lab, which is in France. And there's some really good evidence that language can be attrited to to a point of where it's seemingly gone. Now, some research shows that there's some advantages in so-called relearning or reacquisition in the most basic levels of language, like phonology, like phonology, for example. Okay, so we don't know. Now, here's what we do kind of know and what we do think. Remember, I said that active bilingualism and active engagement seems to be the best predictor of these potential knock-on cognitive effects, and certainly language change. We also know that the brain is really plastic. Okay, so to the extent that the brain is plastic, while you're engaging in something, when you stop engaging with something, your brain can revert. So parts of the brain both expand and they retract. And that is often commensurable to the continuation and the maintenance of something, okay? So to the extent that might be true, but it's an empirical question and it's an open-ended question, not if you've really forgot, and therefore remember that loop that we talked about, that activation, suppression, that tension between the two creates a mechanism. If that's gone, then your brain's plastic enough potentially to not retain any of those effects. But again, this is an empirical question. Then also nice thing, which you didn't ask, but I'm going to say about plasticity, is that means that start learning now, 60-year-olds. You know, it's not going to be the same effect, or 70-year-olds or 80-year-olds, but it's something that you can do. And there's a whole literature, it's called cognitive training, and maybe language is something that would be an exceptionally good type of cognitive training to build what's called cognitive and brain or neurological reserve, even in later ages. Having done that and maintaining it throughout the lifespan is hypothetically, or we can hypothesize, might be more, but it's never too late because we know the brain is plastic. So plasticity, just like a rubber band, bends in both directions, and you have to keep it taut, right? So we want to keep this up and keep things developing so that we have that tension loop to create that, to mold plasticity in the way that we want it to be molded.
So Jason, if you think we'll have one last question and then we'll be finishing up. And this one will be for some of the few researchers we've got in the audience. And they say, if we want to examine bilinguals' behavior in the L2 language research, should we compare them to a monolingual native speaker control group? What if native speakers have knowledge of other languages? Does this affect their eligibility as a control group?
Okay, so that was a lot of questions in one. And of course, since this is a researcher asking him for researchers, you shouldn't really care what I think because I'm one person, but I'm still going to give you my opinion, okay? Should we be using monolinguals? Yes. Should we be using monolinguals? No. And I think that it depends on the context. I think the time is ripe, and I've been, trying with many others to say this for a long time, despite the fact that I'm not terribly old in my research career. I've been around a little bit, and I many other people, and I think I would, at least I would include myself in that list, have made the case for the fact that there needs to be a bilingual turn or a multilingual turn. I think that Lourdes Ortega has really cornered the market on that those couple words string together. But with this, we really agree. Okay, and the idea is that understanding bilingualism as compared to the benchmark of monolingualism is really missing the mark for many questions. That said, okay, so the idea is, I find it much more interesting to understand why bilinguals differ from each other, for example, right? Why different types of bilinguals different, second language learners versus, say, simultaneous bilinguals versus, older and later at different ages, second language learners, people with different proficiencies. What about their backgrounds, right? How did you attain that proficiency or not? I find it much more interesting to understand how bilinguals differ from each other because they will share something in common, and that is the space of that other language, okay? Should we use monolinguals? Sometimes we have to, okay? Sometimes we need to. Methodologically, sometimes it's extremely prudent. When available, I should say, monolinguals. Monolinguals are not always available. And if we have to have a benchmark of monolinguals, then there's lots of beautiful languages we just won't be able to study. Aloy is a native speaker of one of them. Aloy is one of the closest things I've ever seen to a balanced bilingual, but his native language is Catalan. And if you want to look at Catalan, as you should, how do you have a monolingual control? They don't exist, or they really don't exist. Let's be honest. Okay. So at the end of the day, if we want to look at certain languages, we just can't have monolinguals, and that's okay. Right. We can look at people who have relative dominance, right? Maybe we could look at dominance and differences in dominance across bilinguals. But I think the time is ripe for us to understand that bilinguals are not cannot ever be a double monolingual in one mind, and that's not interesting. I mean, for me, it's not interesting. If it is for you, I don't need any more studies, to be honest with you, that show me how second language learners and heritage speakers and other types of bilinguals are different from monolinguals. How could they not be? Frankly, if you want to really get into fine-grained granality. Now, there are interesting questions to pursue related to that. But I think that the answer to should you have to have it? No. Do you want to publish your work? Well, that's a different story, depending on who the editor of the journal or the reviewers are. But I think that we're gravitating out of this default idea that a monolingual has to be there. You do need a control. You do need proper methodology. You have to have something against which you control or manipulate, something that you can hold constant, but you can do that within bilingualism. It doesn't have to be monolinguals. Certain methods, we want to know how monolinguals act so we can remove a particular variable. So it's not a yes/no question, but it's a much more no, you don't need it than it is. It's certainly not yes, you have to have it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's been great. It's been great to see so many people here, loads of questions. Hopefully we've addressed some of your questions, and hopefully you can take something home, even though you might already be home. So with this, we'll finish for today, and we'll So thank you, Jason. Thank you.
If there's any questions that are still remaining there, we'll take a couple minutes to hear. And we're sitting in the lab in Tromsø right now at a reasonable social distance, I have to say. And we can answer some of these questions before we finish up today. But thank you all very much. Thanks to the ESRC who funded this. I'm very sorry that Aloy didn't get to quite finish his intended project before he moves on, but many people would be jealous to have to leave slightly early and under these conditions to have such a wonderful job. So thank you all so much for listening. And yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye, thanks.